The new Alone in the Dark is actually a half-decent game. One of its highlights that you will find is that it absolutely nails the atmosphere and tone. It's just its overall art design and art direction are all so fantastically done. If you look at some of the environments and the lighting, you'll see what I mean. It's got these beautiful vistas scattered throughout the game, like this Egyptian desert setting, which is really quite stunning. And it also gets its primary setting and tone, much of which is in Derceto Manor, set in 1920s Louisiana. Right, says the guy who's never been to either of those. But from what I do know of them, it captures it beautifully and is without a doubt one of the standout aspects of this game. And I know it probably won't make a whole lot of sense, but it felt like this was a mod for Resident Evil 2 Remake, or really any of the newer games running in the RE engine. What I mean by this is like how the Forgotten City, underrated game by the way, was originally a mod for Skyrim with its own unique setting, cast of characters, and story. And so this feels like a similar thing, as if it were running in the same engine. Which it's not. It's actually running in Unreal Engine 4, just as Final Fantasy VII Rebirth surprisingly did too. Of course, their own modified version of it I'm sure, but still surprising nonetheless. Either way, if this game feels like it used inspiration from Resident Evil, that's because Resident Evil and everything else in the genre was influenced and set off by the original Alone in the Dark back in 1992. Yes, in case you were unaware, this is a reimagining of that classic and another entry in the long-running series. So while one may argue that the recent Resident Evil games and their style may have influenced this, Alone in the Dark actually influenced Resident Evil first, along with the others in the genre. For those of you unfamiliar, this is essentially the second crack at reviving the series. They tried it once in 2008, and it failed big time. I've never actually personally played the game or any other games in the series beyond this one, but I've only heard some not so great things, to say the least. And so, this is their second attempt at breathing new life into the franchise. And I think they almost have it, but there's still some pieces missing that could elevate it so much more. They nail the atmosphere, like I said. They do a great job with that. And more importantly, they do a great job with the puzzle design. It's clever and it's done really well, and the puzzles in here aren't handholdy either. They're pretty clever. They take a moment to figure out, but it makes sense. And things just work. There's a purpose for all the different elements that are in there when you're trying to solve that puzzle. And a lot of these puzzles will often require you to refer back to your notes to solve it and be able to attribute the numbers to the right symbols or vice versa. It all takes a little bit of thinking to really figure those things out, and it's not really a simple puzzle design where you might flip this red lever or green lever in this room and then suddenly it unlocks the doorway or whatever. I don't know if there's a game particularly like that, but you know, there are games where puzzles are usually much simpler. But this one is a bit more on the complex side, but also not too overly complex that you won't be able to solve it either. It's just done really well. And I think that this alone will be enough to carry you through, because it definitely did for me. That, coupled with the atmosphere, was enough for me to sit through the first 9-hour playthrough. Demos for games have been making a resurgence recently, and I love that they're doing that. The purpose of them is to see whether or not a game is worth buying. Reviews like this one do the same, but they can only do so much. Yes, you can compare and contrast them and make your own informed decision based on them, but you'll never truly know unless you get to experience it for yourself. These demos are meant to give you a taste of what the game is actually like, to better inform you of how the game not only plays, but feels. But the demo for this game, unfortunately, fails to do that. It's an incredibly short chapter prologue that will take you about 6 minutes to beat. 13 tops. And all you pretty much do is walk through a door, walk through a corridor, walk through another door, pick up a letter, walk back through the corridor, down the stairs, walk through the hallway, walk into the room, and then slide into another room. And done. That's it. That's the whole thing. I know it probably sounds like I'm being unfair because this doesn't actually reflect the actual game itself, and considering that it's meant to just set up the tone and the atmosphere, but it's more just feedback for the devs and publishers for future reference. And I don't see how at least adding in a few puzzles and lengthening a bit could have hurt. Or better yet, just giving us the first chapter of the game, or at least a section of it, if they might for some reason be concerned about the spoilers. As you've seen from the thumbnail and all the promotional material for this game, it stars Hollywood actors Jodie Comer, who plays Emily Hartwood, and David Harbour, who plays Edward Carnby. As big names slapped onto this game, you might expect a much higher caliber of voice acting. But that's where you'd be wrong. Normally, Jodie and David are excellent actors, and are so good in what they're in, but here, the dialogue and delivery of our dual protagonists are very subpar compared to the voice acting talents that we have in most other games these days. During my first playthrough, I chose to play as Emily, and during this playthrough, her line delivery most of the time was incredibly flat and sounded as though she was reading her lines for the first time. And I don't blame her. Part of the reason I suspect may have to do with it is adapting her voice to another accent. In her case, adapting it from British to American. Think Daisy Ridley or James McAvoy's performance in 12 minutes. Again, two Hollywood actors who are normally great, but struggled with this. So the accent's the culprit, huh? Well, no, there's actually more to it. One might assume that there's a difference between acting in film and acting in games. But in recent years, the gap has been closing because of performance capture. It's part of the reason why games like Death Stranding, overloaded with Hollywood actors, are still so incredible. The problem here was actually because if you look at the behind the scenes footage, you'll notice that they aren't doing full performance capture, so they can't take advantage of their full range of emotion, which is in an area of acting that they're probably more accustomed to. Instead, it's just the headgear that captures their face, but not their movement or body language. So the expressions get transferred over, but nothing else, making it feel stilted and more difficult to project a full range of emotions. What's worse is that David Harbour confirmed that the actors never actually recorded in the same room together, or at the same time, which is integral to an actor's performance whether it is on a regular set or in a recording booth. Without it, you can also have very different tonal shifts in your line delivery, making it sound awkward and weird, and it can stick out like a sore thumb, breaking some of that immersion. It's strange why they approached it like this, and if the budget was a concern, it would have been better spent on performance capture than two huge Hollywood actors. Now, I will say that at least during my second playthrough, David's performance did get better compared to when he was a supporting character in the first playthrough, where he sounded especially dull, but it wasn't particularly great either. Because of this, during the first playthrough with Emily, I had a difficult time grasping what was actually going on in this game. I had played through all 9 hours of it, and by the end, I still had no idea what actually just happened. The entire plot was pretty much lost on me. I knew who some of the characters were and how they were connected, but much of it completely went over my head simply because I was not engaged enough in the dialogue where much of the plot gets revealed. I did manage the puzzles just fine, so it's not like I was completely disengaged, but I was definitely not engaged enough to understand the story or care about what any of the characters were saying. Part of it could be ADHD, sure. But also when the acting itself lacks, and the characters aren't that well fleshed out, then naturally, some of that critical information is probably just gonna fly past your head, which is exactly what it did for me. Now, I could have stopped here and reviewed it right away, but it didn't feel right. I knew I must have misunderstood, and that maybe it's actually great and I'm just a big dummy. But before I started playing this game, I remembered hearing that it's actually pretty crucial to play both playthroughs to fully understand the story. Now, I wasn't sure if that was just another marketing thing to get you to continue to play, or if they actually genuinely meant it, and that the reason I didn't really understand what was going on was because I only had half the story. But that's not really the case. Now, I did my second playthrough as Edward Carnby, which ran about 6 hours this time, and I actually understood the main plot and story a lot more. And part of the reason is, for one, there's a familiarity factor at play, and two, because I was able to engage with the characters more. David Harbour acted a bit more naturally, and the dialogue seemed like it was originally written for him, which might have bolstered the delivery compared to Jodie's. Of course, this is just conjecture and is an observation I made without any real concrete evidence, so take this with a grain of salt, but it seemed like the game was developed with him as the true main protagonist, as a lot of the story beats just clicked in place better with him, which would make sense considering he was the original protagonist in 1992 after all. To be clear, both playthroughs of this game, whether you're Emily or Edward, are essentially the same with the exception of a few cutscenes that don't really impact the main story, and a couple of puzzles exclusive to each one. With a dual protagonist story, you would think that they would approach it like they do in Resident Evil, where they have two stories running concurrently alongside each other that are their own. Now, I know this might have been too much to ask given perhaps budget constraints, but I think I would have much preferred it if it worked in a similar way. Instead, they opted to have a single story that has characters that are interchangeable, rather than having separate stories and paths developed for each of them, furthering their goals and motivations. For Emily, it makes sense that she'd want to go look for her uncle, and so there's already a natural connection to the plot, but Edward was nothing more than a private investigator hired to look into this. Yet, I was still sold on him more, based on his more natural interactions with the supporting cast. Interestingly enough though, as I was writing this review, I stumbled across other people's perspectives, and some of them actually felt the opposite. Instead of Emily, it was Edward that got shorthanded in their opinion. But a lot of them did say that they played as him first, so I wonder if that is a contributing factor. But either way, this reaction tells you that at least one of the two main characters is lacking. If you're going the dual protagonist route, it's important to have these alternate storylines because without it, there isn't much incentive for replayability. Yes, they have multiple endings, one of which I accidentally triggered towards the end, but I don't feel like that's really enough. For me and other survival horror fans, there already innately is replayability based off of the puzzle design and exploration, but for those of you who are more invested in the plot, you aren't really going to be as satisfied. Personally, I was able to play it through twice over because, as I'd mentioned, the familiarity can actually bring a sense of comfort. As ironic as that sounds in a horror game. Like, call me weird, but that's what made Dead Space a weird comfort game for me over the years, because I'm so familiar with the Ishimura at this point, I know exactly what to do and what to expect. It's like clockwork. The combat feels really clunky and is definitely not one of the selling points of this game. It's serviceable, it does the job, especially the gunplay, but since it's a survival horror game, its focus really isn't on how refined the combat is. It doesn't need to be particularly thorough or extensive, and it just needs to be straightforward and simple enough, and that's exactly what it does. They provide you with a pistol, a shotgun, and a Tommy, and can be easily swapped with the directional buttons as expected. The melee combat is the thing that I think most people will notice is probably the clunkiest part about it, because it just feels really directionless. Any weapon you're using lacks precision, and you'll basically just end up flailing it around in the air a ton. It's still not a huge deal, because combat isn't the most important thing in these games, but it is something that you will come to notice. But one of the more baffling things that I didn't understand in regards to the combat was when you interact with some of the throwables. In other games, when you interact with the world and there are throwables, for example in The Last of Us, you are usually able to pick up that brick or that bottle or whatever that may be, and it will now be added to your weapon slot, and then you can save it for a more dire situation and equip it and throw it at your leisure. In this game, they decided to make the decision to make it so that whenever you have a throwable item you can interact with in this world, you can only pick it up in that one spot. Yeah, you can sort of walk around with it if you hold down the trigger button and you just continue aiming until you sort of inch towards an enemy, but I mean, that is going to slow you down and it just ends up not being worth it, and it's just kind of weird. Usually if you do want to use them, you have to make sure that they're close enough, so maybe you need to sort of go out, lure them towards you, and then when the time is right, then you go ahead, pick it up, and throw it. But at that point, you're better off using one of your guns or even one of your melee weapons. Even that's better. On to technical issues. There aren't a ton of them, it plays fine enough, it's not perfect, I feel like no game really is these days, but there are a few bugs and technical issues to note. It's nothing game breaking or anything, but you probably will notice that some of them crop up every now and again, and most of them are kind of just weird visual things. You might notice this weird floppy handle, for example, that just flops. It kind of fixes itself after a while, and it hasn't really happened to me more than once. You'll also probably notice the textures bleed sometimes, but it's kind of just tiny things like that really.
Actually, hold on. Editor Mel here. I don't know exactly what's going on, but for some reason, while I'm editing this, like, the part that I'm trying to use to show as evidence, which is what I usually do, I usually pair the audio with whatever visual is going on, just so that you know, especially when it comes to things like this, where I'm trying to show an example of, you know, the screen bleeding. But you can't see that here, because for some reason, I don't know what's going on. When I bring that footage into the editor itself, the timeline, it just doesn't show up, that little thing. It's like it fixes itself. I don't know what's going on. But then I was like, did I just imagine that? So I went back to the actual video file. If I look at it in QuickTime, here, let me show you. And you'll see it like right there. Watch closely. You see that? Right there. Right there! But then when we look at the actual timeline editor, you'll only see something like that, where, yeah, you'll see that little pop-in, but none of that. So I have no idea what's going on. It seems like this editor has technical issues of its own. But I suppose these are the editing woes. Anyway, back to the video.
There are moments though where I did find myself getting stuck in an area unable to move, where they almost get clipped to the ground, I assume, and then get stuck momentarily as if there's an invisible object obstructing movement. And there was actually a moment where I almost got stuck entirely, which I'm sure would have been fixed with a simple reload. But yeah, that is just another thing to look out for and may differ depending on what platform you're playing this on. I can only speak to PS5, but I'd imagine it probably plays similarly across the board. For some people, this game isn't going to land, and I understand why it wouldn't, but for those of you who just crave more survival horror games, I think you'll really enjoy this one. I think part of the reason I had lowered my expectations for it was that I knew that their voice acting performance was going to be weak just from the trailers leading up to the release on their own. In addition to that, the game is priced cheaper than most, so I'm a little bit more forgiving. Here in Canada, it retails for about 60 Canadian, but if you pre-ordered it like I did, you would have saved about $6, so it wasn't too bad, especially if you consider redeeming some of your PlayStation points. All in all, it's not a bad game, and while it won't land for everyone, it does have legs and potential to grow from decent to great.